Today was an exciting day for me because I was waiting for a shipment of boats. There you can see the truck pulling up. It wasn't a full truck, but there were a bunch of boats in there. I was a happy guy. The first load I pulled out myself, and it was a bunch of touring kayaks. But that's not what this video was about. Happy to have some new boats. You know I got plans for these things. This one in particular I had my eye on. The first thing to do, of course, was to put it in the water. I put the old trusty 5-horse on it, and then I slipped it in the water for its first test. I already had an idea as to what I wanted to do, but first I had to see how it performed. I was pleasantly surprised at the way this boat handled. It skipped along the water pretty cool. I was just wondering though, what if I had more than one of those? It was time to test the theory to see whether or not this boat could actually handle that. In order to do it, I needed a surrogate motor. Both of these batteries weigh exactly the same as one of those 5-horses, 57 pounds. With 3 of them back there, I would know what I needed to know. This boat was handling it great. It had no issue with all that weight in the back. Wheels are really turning now. This was time for me to commit to an idea that would make this boat go a lot faster. Well, my first step was to take the boat and put it up on the operating table. Yes, sir, this was going to be a lot of work. The first thing I got around to was repurposing the pallet that the boats came on. The next thing to do was to draw up some plans. I had an idea of the additional flotation I would need, and it started back here at the transom. What I had first perceived as a flat back on this boat turned out to have a lot of shape. With a considerable amount of doing, I got a piece of wood to fit nice and snug, and I screwed it through the existing transom, which had a big piece of wood in it. Then I proceeded to do it all over again. This time I had to drill through the base of the boat. With those two pieces attached, I just made little side pieces, which was considerably easier. Although, I can't just have it easy. I had to mimic the shape of the boat. I mean, there's no reason it can't look good. So out came the old trusty jigsaw. Uh-oh. Maybe not so trusty. Thank goodness I had a scroll saw to get the job done. I was really pushing the limits of that thing though. But it worked. Now it's starting to look like something. Now the job was to make it a little bit thicker. Sure is nice to have a wood stash laying around. Frame was almost done, a little flimsy, but I had plans to stiffen it up. This bamboo fencing that I had laying around worked nicely. Actually, it was just going to be a support for what was going to go on top of it. But before I got to that, I needed to cut some holes in this boat. As I suspected, there was nothing in the back of this boat, and it was definitely going to need to get stiffened up. Speaking of which, that box that I built was going to need some more support besides what was just in the transom. Holes in the sides would eventually get bolts in them. And in places where I couldn't reach with a drill, a red-hot Allen wrench seemed to work. This was all kind of new territory, so even though this sounds like a how-to video, I was kind of learning as I went. With the rest of the supports on the back of this box, it was time to really stiffen it up. I knew this was going to make it strong, somewhat waterproof, and it was going to make it look nice. But man, I really wasn't looking forward to it. Fiberglass is itchy and the chemicals are gross. And it certainly is messy. But it had to be done. Now that's starting to look a lot nicer. And now it was time to make sure this thing was going to float. This two-part foam is meant for exactly that, to add buoyancy, and to make it so that if any water got in there, it wouldn't get real heavy and sink the boat. I tried to do small increments and do it in a very scientific way instead of just have it explode everywhere. What we have here is foam, a chemical process in which two parts expand to 16 times their volume It is made of star stuff. It is composed of billions of cells, and this is what should make our boat float. Obviously, lately I had been watching a little bit of Carl Sagan's old show, The Cosmos. It was wearing off on me. This project was pretty epic. Not as epic as, you know, discovering the cosmos, but I was enjoying myself nonetheless. And it was about time to really commit and glue this thing to the back of the boat. This entire thing weighed about 35 pounds, but I figured it was going to add about 120 pounds of extra flotation to the boat. That's just the footprint on the outside. The Coast Guard rates these boats, however, on how much foam they have inside. So after this thing was really screwed down tight to the back of the boat, I figured I'd add a little more of that Coast Guard flotation to the inside, which essentially only means that if water ever got inside the boat, the thing wouldn't go to the bottom and it would continue to float a little bit, even if it were swamped. That was the plan, at least. To implement the plan, it took a lot of cups and a lot of rounds of mixing foam together. Okay, hopefully this boat now has sufficient flotation for what I'm about to do to it. It's certainly a lot stiffer. I'm going to add a little more foam in here though, and really make the back of this indestructible. These pieces of composite board, which I have laying around, made good covers to fill those holes that I had made earlier. The name of that is King Starboard, and I'll talk more about that later. Meantime, time for foam. Now with those voids here filled with foam, this is solid as a rock compared to that, which is soft and pliable. So this triangular piece acts as a gusset to support the entire back of the boat. Another cool thing is that nothing sticks to polyethylene, so whatever I dripped will clean up really easily. Speaking of cleaning up, it's time to cut the excess stuff that's too high off of the back here. Another thing that needed cutting were the seats. The main reason for doing this was to salvage the plastic so that I could make that back transom look nicer by using the same exact plastic that the rest of the boat was made out of. My idea was to make this thing look as factory as I could. Some of the plastic I used had to be a different color because of the big size that I needed. But I got around that by using a little spray paint. The staples in this gun were meant to be outside, maybe not on the water, but I eventually wanted to cover them and didn't worry about them rusting really too bad. Here I'm making some gussets that are going to stiffen up that piece in the back, and they would sit right on top of where those staples were. I tried to hide as many of the screws as I possibly could, just to keep them out of the weather. Some on the back would be exposed, but it's okay. I think this thing was starting to look pretty nice. It's a good thing I had a lot of cardboard laying around. And starboard, of course. It added a lot of weight to the back of this boat, but I knew that it made up for it by adding a lot more extra flotation. So after I had the back getting close, it was time to think about what I was going to do for a seat. And I happened to have a seat sitting over here, and it was too nice to pass up. I quickly got to messing around and took this thing apart. Minus the swivel in the base, I set the seat down and walked over here to get some cardboard in order to start designing the center console. I also dipped into my wood stash. An idea was starting to develop, and it was going to require some heavy-duty cutting. I was really liking my new replacement jigsaw. I had been using a piece of junk for so long, it was nice to have a real tool to play with. Speaking of real, these grinding discs made short work of shaping these things to fit. Made short work of making a mess, too. Cutting this stuff wasn't exactly that easy, though, and I didn't want to be wasteful, so I made a lot of templates out of cardboard. This was a very quick way for me to figure out whether or not I was going to like the shape of the center console that I was designing. Feels good. I also had to figure out how I was going to make this thing work from up there. So as I was designing it and trying to make it look good, I was also trying to figure out how to make a throttle and a shifter. Since there were 3 motors, I would need 3 throttles and 3 shifters. I wanted them to work independently, so I couldn't just have a single handle. Here was my initial idea for 3 different handles. They'd all use a single pivot point, and now it was a matter of just trying to find a place for it. Right here would do nicely. To try to stabilize this thing, I thought a handle across the top. Yeah. This was going to tie them all together and hopefully be removable so that I could use them individually. This build started getting a little more intricate than I usually like, though. I don't exactly have precise tools. But with some care, I was able to make that work. With the idea finalized, I turned my attention back to the center console and decided to make it permanent by designing it out of king starboard instead of just plain old cardboard. If you guys think that this took a long time, imagine me in real time. So it was nice to have a break when the UPS guy brought some new toys. Things were starting to feel very real as I hand trucked these things inside the warehouse. And finally put my DIY sawhorse to use. The idea was to figure out whether or not these things were going to fit. It was going to be really tight with those tiller handles on them. So, the first task was to take these brand new motors and start taking them apart. I was surprised how easily these tiller handles came off. Pleasantly surprised, I must say. Because things like the throttle cables had to be rerouted, and this is something I had never done before. I quickly realized I was going to need a hole here. The speed square made sure that the drill bit didn't go through the gas tank. Next, I had to design a bracket that would help tie all three motors together. I screwed all three of these together after I cut them out, and that made sure they were all symmetrical. Temporarily screwed them to the motors, and then temporarily tied all three of those together. And this was actually a pretty cool moment. It was neat seeing all three of them turn together. Meantime, work went on to make the rest of the back of the boat look pretty, and to get the center console working, which meant installing the kill switches up front. This material was too thick, so I had to router it like halfway through so that I'd be able to tighten down the factory kill switches. I don't know what I would do without that little Dremel tool. Meantime, there was that hole in the motors where the tiller handles were. I plugged them up with, you guessed it, King Starboard. I swear I could do anything with that stuff. Now all the cables. To measure the cables, I used string, or rope, or line, or whatever you guys call them. I paid it out and taped it in place, and then wrapped them up to bring to the marine store. I was going to Bullfrog Creek Marine to see my friend Mark. I was hoping to get some advice from him, because I felt a little bit like I was over my head. What's up? What the heck is this?
That is an ancient tiller cable steering wheel.
That is pretty cool.
Back when they did it with cables and pulleys.
I see. Keep it simple.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That's exactly what I'm not doing.
I see.
Let's discuss. Mark is an extremely generous guy when it comes to giving advice and helping people fix their boats. If you have a boat and you want an honest opinion, an honest mechanic, a good mechanic, go see Mark at Bullfrog Creek. So I got myself a brand new used steering wheel, and I'm DIYing a lot of this stuff on this boat. But I wanted to defer to an expert here because there's certain things you just don't want to mess around with. And Mark said something to me that I thought was actually really deep, which is...
Yeah, so you trying to make steering work, you really want to be careful because boats don't have brakes, so you have to be able to steer clear from danger. June 30th, 1985, I got run over by a boat because its steering broke. I'm kind of a poster child for why you don't mess around with steering.
It's one of a million reasons why I turn to Mark when it comes to learning how to do things properly. So thank you, man. I appreciate it. I came home with all the cables that I needed, a steering wheel, and a cup holder, which was cool. And instructions. I don't need no instructions. I was glad, though, that I had a way to use the old transom, the one that came with the boat. I didn't want to just leave it there and not put it to good use. It turned out to be a great place to mount the steering system that I bought from Mark. I might have been able to do this by myself, but buying these things had to be a lot safer, and it was definitely a lot quicker. Routing the cables, however, that was pretty difficult. There was only a little bit of space inside the hull and the inside of this boat, but just enough for me to make it work. Making the shifter work, though, that was going to require a whole bunch of little brackets. Fiddly work that I probably couldn't have made with wood. Again, that wonderful composite material, starboard, came into play. Attaching the cables to the motors also required a little bit of fiddly work. These brackets had to pivot also, because the shift handle doesn't just go forward and backwards. The back end of the cables I just attached to the motor housing with a bolt. They required little spacers, but that was easy enough to make. Setting it up like this, the cable sheath itself moved and the cable stayed put. Actually seeing it work was quite an achievement for me. Then I had to take the front end of the cable and attach it to my homemade linkage. Then there were the kill switches. Those had to be done as well. I looked around for some wire to use, because I'm a cheapskate, and I saw this telephone wire here hanging. It had been there a long time. I figured nobody was using that. I might have been mistaken.
Okay, babe, I'll see you soon. Babe? Marty! What are you doing?
But hey, copper is copper, and this stuff got the job done. Getting these kill switches operational was pretty important, not only to be able to shut the motors off, but as a safety precaution in case I were to fall out of the boat wouldn't just keep on going. To tether it to myself, I found an old anklet from an SUP. The next task was going to be a little bit difficult because the throw on the throttle handle was about 6 3/4 of an inch. The throw on the cable coming out of the motors was only about 5/8 of an inch. To reduce that was going to require a little bit of ingenuity. These rods here would connect to the throttle handle that I made and then reduce the distance that they moved. This was quite an achievement for a guy who is, again, not usually as fiddly as this. It was so involved it could probably warrant its own video, but here I'm just giving you the highlights. Like this clamp that I made to hold down the cables. Inside this box, these long, rigid pieces here would transfer into the flexible cables that would go the rest of the distance to the motors. Some of it was handmade, like the cable sheath and the bicycle wire, all of which I bought separate. There's actually quite a bit of behind-the-scenes stuff like this that was necessary in order to make this whole contraption work. In order to hide all of this stuff, I utilized the space inside the seat. And it just made for a really clean look. Here you can see the shift handles, the levers, and the box, where the levers have a second fulcrum where the throw changes to 5/8 of an inch through the cable system. Those cables then I drew through the boat using this little fish tape here. And that will make its way back towards the motors. Starting to look a lot like spaghetti back there. But at least it was working so far. Putting all that foam back was pretty important too. I didn't want to lose any of the flotation in case the worst were to happen. Next you can see these disconnects. These are the kill switches. And I also had to devise a way to disconnect the throttle linkage so that I'd be able to put the motors on one at a time. Those crimpers really came in handy, Mark. Thank you for that. Some cargo ties kept the cable sheaths from moving. It seemed like it was going to do the trick. I must say it was rather clever. I was rather proud of myself. Here you can see I'm making a new handle that ties the motors together. Something a little more stout and something that wouldn't flex as much. With the throttle and the shift linkage together, it was just time to make this thing look nice, and I would be close to being finished. One other thing I wanted to do, though, is make sure that there was foam everywhere. I'll put this all back, I promise. Up front there happened to be foam, which is nice, but that was an access point, so I could squirt foam under here. I was going to get a lot of vibration there if I didn't dampen it with some foam. These were also going to be drain points, so that any water that gets in the boat would find its way inside the hull, which is what I wanted. I squirted a lot of foam inside there, into all those holes, not to make it waterproof, but to add flotation and make this boat a little more solid. All the little gaps that didn't have regular white styrofoam got expanding foam. These projects are really meant to be fun, but I also take them very seriously. Playing around on the water can be no joke. Okay, looking good. Let's close her up. The next thing that I made was a box to cover the cables where they come in and out of the boat. This was quite challenging to make everything hold on tight without interfering with the cables. I even had to make a wrench specific for holding on to the nylock nuts that were behind it. Worked out good, and it looked great. Well, we're starting to get there. It's partly due to the fact that I have king starboard laying around, which is what this material is. It's so wonderful to build with. And the manufacturers of that stuff actually sent me a gift. Check this out. How cool is that? This is King Color Core, and you can see there's multiple layers, and you can get this in different thicknesses. And then you can router out the top layer and it leaves a different color behind. It's great for signage and for projects like this. Look at how cool that looks. Oh my gosh. Yeah, the folks at King Plastics heard that I was building something pretty crazy, and they very kindly sent me these. Oh man, that really sets everything off. Alright. Let's finish building this. Many thanks to King Plastics for hooking me up like that. And of course for Pelican for making this boat and giving me opportunities constantly to play around. Here I'm taking some of the extra plastic that I cut out from the seat and giving some props to the company that makes all these boats that I play with. This was also going to make the top of the center console look pretty sharp. Underneath it all there was a drain hole, and that's where I was going to make all the water inside the hull come back out. But I would do it not using gravity, I would do it using a bilge pump. First I needed a DIY through hull. Now if I were to take on a wave or something, I'd be able to get all that water out rather quickly. This boat's called the Intruder 12 by Pelican, but this particular one I'm calling the Intruder 12 X3. It's always fun adding your own little personal touches to a boat. And having ways to capture it on camera. The folks at Scotty helped make that happen. I just had to wrestle out this stupid oar lock. I didn't think I'd be needing those oar locks anymore. I might need a place to keep my lures though, as I'm probably going to do some fishing someday from this boat. One of the last things I did was make a place to put a battery, and that was going to be used to run the bilge pump. And this is the switch I would use to turn it on. Beautiful. Oh yeah, gasoline. Nice to have a place for some extra gas. And you know what? I couldn't really believe it, but this boat, this build, was finally finished. Okay, I think it's time to take this thing out on the water. I took the motors off, and then I slid the boat into the water. The boat now weighed 244 pounds, so it was pretty much all I could do to wrestle that thing down to the water. But it was doable. The motors I put on one at a time, and then hooked all the linkage, and it was time to play and have some fun. Okay, steering seems to work, and now just the shifter. All right, let's put this in forward. Throttle. Well, you know, guys, I gotta tell you, this boat is a lot of fun, and I understand that it's not practical. I mean, 3 motors, 3 5-horse motors are only going to achieve a certain amount of speed. I probably could go faster with only 1 15-horse. But practicality is not really what this project is about. This project is about what I do so often in life, which is listen to my heart instead of my brain. I've done that many, many times. I mean, moving onto a boat, starting a business, doing a lot of things that sometimes don't seem like the best idea, but something that I really want to do, something that I have to do. This project was definitely one of them, and I appreciate you guys coming along and watching. So you never know when I'm going to do something stupid like this again. Thank you for everybody who has subscribed. I really appreciate it, and if you can share this video, it's going to help me pay for all these motors, because this temporary obsession is going to cost me. Catch you later.